Welcome back to A Bite from the Money Sandwich, where we provide practical and easy to understand tips and ideas on how to manage your money better so as to let you retire with comfort and on your own terms. Do you know what to do if your elderly parents need assistance or need to move into aged care? Sometimes we can plan for this, but more often than not, it is thrust upon us, say, with a major health issue, and usually we are not prepared, don't know what to do, or where to turn to for help. Today, I'm talking with Louise Biti, the co-founder and director of Aged Care Steps. Louise will be talking about the realistic challenges you face with aging parents, how you can help, and importantly, understand you are not alone and there is help available. Louise will also be talking about her top tips to help you make informed decisions about when your parents need to take these next steps. Well, welcome, Louise. It's great to have you on this podcast.
Thanks, Mark. I'm really enjoying being here.
Just to probably start, because I know you're a lady of many talents. You're a self-made super fund specialist, tax specialist, financial advisor. What actually led you to the aged care arena?
Oh, apart from being a complete nerd, I think aged care is just an area that I've always been really interested in. And you're right, I've always played with the legislation. And I've enjoyed the challenge of analysing legislation, putting it together, thinking about how it can be used creatively but legally. But I think the aged care side intrigued me because it really brought all of those strategic financial planning skills around super and tax and social security. And you had to be able to put it all together with an understanding of human elements, and how we react and behave to finances and the emotions. And so it became quite a challenging but complex area, but one that's very much appreciated by consumers and people as well, because we all find this a particularly confronting topic to talk about. And it's so full of emotions when we're talking about our parents or our own frailty periods and things. So I think I just really enjoyed that challenge of pulling it all together, and particularly as it wasn't related to product. It was just related to people, what they wanted to be able to do, what they need to achieve, and solving those family crisis problems. And I think also importantly, nobody else was playing in this space. When I looked at it, I saw aged care as just being so important, and nobody else was focused on it. So I think I just took an opportunity to say this is a gap that we can fill and needs to be filled.
You're absolutely right. There isn't a lot of people, and there still isn't a lot of people in this space, or actually even doing it well anyway. One of the things I think it is hard for a lot of advisors, and I was one of them that was looked at this probably about 7 or 8 years ago, and I actually enjoyed the estate planning side more than the aged care. Because I actually felt exactly as you just said there. There was a really human element, and you do need to have a certain type of personality. I know one specialist I know has a box of tissues always there at the handy, because it is a very emotional topic.
Yeah, we often talk about when we're looking at aged care that we talk about the 3 Gs of aged care, because we think so much of what happens and the decisions are made are driven by these 3 Gs, which are grief, guilt, and unfortunately the third one is greed. Where there's families, there's money, that comes into as well. Now, they're all natural human emotions, and I don't think they're always playing out for a malicious end, but all 3 are going to be there in some form. And so you're right, having that box of tissues sometimes can be important, because we are very much in that grief state, but we don't recognise as much. And it's interesting to compare the difference between estate planning and frailty planning when that aged care needs comes in. When we're looking at estate planning and death, we all know that's inevitable, and as much as we would hope it's not, it is. So we accept that as part of life, and we know that's a sad moment, and we know to grieve. Aged care and that earlier part, that frailty planning, is equally a grief stage, because we're facing an imminent death. We are changing, we're losing the person we were or the person our parents were, and that nature of that relationship is changing as well. But we don't quite recognise that as a grieving period, because our parents are still there. We can still see them. And so I think it is really understanding those emotions are going to be there. You know, there is going to be grief and we need to accept and deal with that. We're faced with a whole lot of guilt, you know, the guilt about we should be looking after our parents, we shouldn't be putting them into aged care and those things. But sometimes they're the right places and the right choices that we're making. So again, recognize them, deal with them, and be very mindful to try to minimize that greed element coming in as well.
And you've raised a lot of good points there. I think I'm part of an association which has a lot of Asian advisors, and they often talk to me and say, you know, in Australia, you just put your parents in these homes. You know, we would never think of doing that. You know, our parents live with us, and it's a different culture. So I think that guilt element is very strong. So it's how do people, when you're sort of dealing with people who are talking to, you know, might be their adult children who are having to help their elderly parent into an aged care, overcome that guilt, or that this is actually the right decision for them?
Yeah, it is a really, really hard conversation. And you're right, different cultures address it differently. But even if you look at some of the Asian cultures, just the reality of modern life means there are often less children in a family. They're often more geographically dispersed.
Yes.
They are also, our lives are busy. We've got so many competing interests. Our careers often peak at the same time as our caregiving needs peak as well. And we've got this whole issue around the sandwich generation where, you know, people in my age, we're likely to have issues around children or grandchildren and looking after them and our own parents. Our careers are peaking. We're trying desperately to save for our retirements. And that all comes at the same time, and that becomes difficult. So then we've got this guilt thing about how do we look after our parents? I said, even in some of those Asian cultures, aged care is emerging as an issue, and residential care and community care is emerging because the children and the families just can't do it all anymore. So I think we need to recognise and be kinder to ourselves that we can't do it all. I think we also need to think about that in many cases, by the time a parent needs that aged care, the safest and most convenient place for them to be is sometimes residential care, where then we can maintain that relationship with them as the child and not as their jailer if they've got dementia or their carer, because we can pay people to do that. But sometimes it's that really human part of just being the child, staying in that relationship and supporting them to get proper, you know, qualified care in some other residential environment. We shouldn't feel guilty about that. And I have this conversation with my mother, so I hope she doesn't listen to this podcast at all. But I have this conversation with my mother where my father is developing dementia and she looks after him. They stay at home and they look after him. And she always says to me, please don't put him into an aged care home. If something happens to me, don't put him into aged care, because he would really hate that. Maybe he would, maybe he wouldn't. You know, it depends, because they can be fabulous social places to be with lots of other people around you and attention and support. But she says, please don't do that. And I always have the conversation and say, I can't guarantee that. I said, you can't put that guilt on me, because we see all the time where families go, I feel really guilty putting dad into care because I promised mum I wouldn't do that. And I always say to her, I can't promise you that I won't, but what I can promise you is I know the range of options that are available. I know how to find the right place that would suit him at the time with the resources and what we think is the best decision. And that's as much as I can do. Because I'm just saying to her, she can't give me that guilt trip. So I think we need to have honest conversations. And this is it. My mum and dad don't want to talk about it. I probably don't really want to talk about it with them either, but we need to. We need to talk about it.
Yeah, and I know the sandwich generation very well, since that's me, and that's why I wrote the book. It's definitely, as an as being the adult child and having to deal, I always said to our friends, once you turn 50, it would have been great to have a manual, because exactly as you said, you're getting probably to the peak of where your career is. Your children are leaving school, but they're not leaving home. But you also now have elderly parents who are living longer, and you are needing to have this conversation. And we actually, put in quotation marks the conversation. And maybe this is exactly where, your service and how you help people and help other advisors, sometimes having a third party actually makes it a lot easier, because you, just as you said, you're an expert in this field, but you don't like having that conversation with your own parents, and I don't either. And so sometimes having a third person who can be independent, not emotional, don't have that emotional investment in this situation, is actually a positive thing to have.
I'd agree with you, Mark. I think it's absolutely it. We don't have these conversations as families because we don't want to, and for a whole range of reasons. But that third party, the objective person who's seen lots of families go through this, because that's the other thing, for you and I to go through this, we probably experience it once, maybe twice. It's something that's not we don't see a lot, and we don't see how other people handle it. We don't see what's acceptable and what's normal. And that makes it really confronting for us as children of older parents. But that a financial planner or advisor who's experienced and qualified and accredited to give aged care advice, who's seen a lot of different families and what issues come up and how they've managed to create solutions and have those conversations, know what other referral support networks are out there, that when they see a problem that's outside their scope, they can refer you on to solve that as well. I think that's a really powerful tool, and not just at the point a crisis happens, but in that pre-planning. And this is where the conversation I'm at with my parents, even though they're okay today, I know at some point there's a possibility they won't. So it's about talking to them now about what might happen. And the benefit of that is to take away some of the pressure if a crisis occurs, but also gives me time to understand them better and go, well, who are they as people? What's most important to them? What are they really worried about giving up? Because we might have to compromise on something. What is it they're willing to give up? What are they just absolutely not willing to give up? So to give you an example on that, my parents live in a small country town, and I'd like them to move to a bigger city where they're closer to services and don't have to drive as much. But they're very reluctant to do that. And that's because they're always so used to having a single-story building with lots and lots of space around them. So they've got neighbours, but they're not really close. And so what I know is that if I then had to move them into an aged care facility, I cannot look at one of those multi-story apartment style buildings, because that would be so foreign, and that's one thing they're not willing to give up. They're not willing to give up their space. So can't look at an apartment style. I would have to look at ground level, maybe smaller cluster housing with beautiful gardens and space. But if I was in the middle of a crisis and they needed help today, I'm not going to have time to do that research and to think about that, and to reassure them that the choices might still fit within something that's an acceptable lifestyle to them. But I can do that if I start the conversation early.
Yeah, and I think doing the research so that you are prepared for that just in case moment, because unfortunately it seems to me, from my experience, probably 90% of people, it just gets thrown on them. Unfortunately, someone falls down, breaks a hip, goes to the hospital, and the doctor says they are not going back home, and you're put on the spot. So if you can actually have done some of that research beforehand. Okay, I wouldn't mind going back to one of the points and getting a bit of the negative out of the way, because you said the third G was greed, and we have seen royal commissions into aged care. We've seen into elder abuse, and sometimes people do the wrong thing, or adult children to their elderly parents, and take advantage. But where do you see those royal commissions? Has do you see now, being a specialist in that area, that there has been improvements? There are actually things that are changing. Where do you see that's all led to?
Yeah, now that's an interesting question because it depends on what element we're looking at. So, with elder abuse, it is most definitely something on the community agenda at the moment. And the Law Reform Commission has put through some papers and recommendations about changes to registers for powers of attorney and other documents as well. If you look at statistics around elder abuse, and we think of elder abuse of some of the things we've seen coming out of the Aged Care Royal Commission, where people were maybe not treated to the standards we would have expected. But elder abuse is a lot more common in the financial side. And the statistics are showing that most of that financial elder abuse is perpetrated by the children. And it's the children using enduring powers of attorney. And so I think that's a concern. But to me, a lot of it is not necessarily, we might define it as elder abuse, but it's not necessarily that malicious criminal elder abuse. And I think it's because parents ask them to become their enduring power of attorney, the kids agree to do that, but nobody really gives them an understanding of what it means to be the enduring power of attorney. What's your responsibility? What's your role? And we see people who will take on that role, help mum or dad move into aged care, pay for a nice aged care, pay for an expensive one, buy them all the extras that they need, and are very comfortable with themselves that they have done the best for mum or dad. They want for nothing. And then look at mum or dad's remaining bank account balance and say, well, mum's not using this money, but I've got a mortgage, I've got all these options. I think I'll just start to distribute. It's my inheritance anyway, and my brothers and sisters and I will start to distribute this inheritance to us now. Now, from a family point of view, everybody might think that looks okay, but that's actually elder abuse.
Yes, right.
Because it's what we call inheritance impatience. And somebody using an enduring power of attorney doesn't have the right to start distributing that estate before the person's passed away. So there is an element of greed within that, but I don't think it's a malicious intention, but it's still defined as that elder abuse. So I do see some of the financial planners are becoming much more aware of this and looking out for it and helping those enduring powers of attorney to discern what's right and what's wrong. And I think that's come out of some of the financial services royal commissions about the code of ethics that they now very firmly apply by, and there's lots of professional conversations around how do we manage those conflicts, and I think that's a good way. The Aged Care Royal Commission has very much focused on the behaviours of the aged care facilities and service providers and helping to make sure we minimise those the physical abuse side and things like that as well. So I think it is improving. There's a long way still to go, but it requires all of us to be very conscious about it on an ongoing basis about what our own activities are and whether they're really parents' interests first or our own interests.
Yeah, and my own experience with aged care from my mother-in-law was some of the most wonderful people you'd ever meet in those aged cares. They really did, I suppose, yes, you can get frustrated, and I can see some of the examples were horrific actually in the Aged Care Royal Commission. But, to me, you take on that job because you must have a first start. You care. Otherwise, why would you do that job? Because it's definitely a thankless job, and some of these people were just heroes to me.
Yeah, I would agree with you that I don't think anybody, or very, very few people, would wake up thinking, I'm off to work to terrorise my clients or, the people that I'm going to be helping on a day-to-day basis. But we did hear some really terrible stories coming out of the Aged Care Royal Commission. But if you put in perspective, that's really what Royal Commissions are trying to uncover is the bad stories. At the moment, there's around 250,000 people who living in residential aged care. And the Royal Commission was looking over a series of, historical events as well. So that's been an awful lot of people going through aged care. And we heard a number of stories, but you didn't hear, and if you look at it in total of all the residents, it was a very, very small number of residents that had those terrible stories, but they were quite horrific. And that's what the Royal Commission was looking for. They didn't go out to find all the people who said, Mum had a lovely day. The staff were really just beautiful to her, and she enjoyed her day and nothing bad went wrong. They weren't the people presenting to the Royal Commission, but they are the bulk of the people in aged care. But having said that as well, we also need to recognise that the aged care industry is a very difficult business model to run. They are operating with quite limited financial resources, and it's going through a massive transformation change at the moment. And this is what the government is pushing forward with its plans to review the aged care industry as well. That back historically, the aged care was really more a hostel type arrangement, which was largely older widowed women who weren't used to living alone, weren't cooking meals properly, so they were living on bread and jam and things like that. Still quite independent, still quite mobile, but just when they were living alone, were not hydrating properly and weren't having proper nutrition and were lonely and were afraid. And so aged care started off as a community living to support that style of person. Whereas I think today, if you look at the much higher levels of acuity in their health needs, very high levels of dementia, a lot of palliative care, and that's all been looked after in aged care. But so the needs of people have become far more intense, and that needs a lot more staff. It needs a lot more skilled staff and equipment, but the funding hasn't kept up with that. So we've changed what our expectations are and what our demands of aged care are, but we haven't really funded them to the level that they need. And that's why sometimes, unfortunately, we do see corners cut. Perhaps there's not enough staff, and those staff are very overworked as well. So that is one issue. And I think the reforms that will come out over the next few years will help to address that. We will also should expect that fees will continue to increase. And so we need to be thinking about how we're going to manage our financial resources to pay for care in the future, because it's not just a government responsibility, it's all of our responsibility.
And I suppose with your superannuation, more and more people who are going to aged care now have had the benefit of superannuation. So hopefully, 10, 15 years ago, people who were going to aged care was still probably the bulk of their income was from aged care pension, whereas hopefully more and more people going into the aged care system now will have the benefit of having, whether it's their house or their superannuation, but hopefully that can do that, because one of the biggest issues I imagine for the aged care sector is we're living longer.
Yeah, we are living longer. And also too, with us living longer, we're also not dying so immediately as well, which means we are living longer. So we're getting to those levels of frailty, and we are more likely to have that frailty period before we pass away as well. So we should expect that we're going to have a period of frailty. That doesn't mean we should all expect to live in residential care, because home care is emerging as a really important option as well. It just means we should all expect that at some point we need help, and we shouldn't be afraid to ask for help. And we could get help from our kids, we could get help from our family, other family and friends, or our spouse. But again, as we talked about with that sandwich generation, maybe, the older people don't want to put pressure on their kids and they don't want to put extra burden. So we should more and more look at what else could we get by paid workers, and the government subsidises that enormously, but we still need to be able to pay for it ourselves. One of the mistakes that we see quite often people making is the mindset that what it costs you for aged care will depend on how much you have in assets and income. So there's a real mindset to, what if I get rid of my assets and income before I need aged care, I'll just start gifting it to all the kids. Then when we get to aged care, I won't have to pay for it. And you go, that might be true, but if you get to aged care and you don't have your own financial resources, then you lose a lot of control and a lot of choice. Because instead of being able to say, what do I want? Where would I like to be? How would I like to live? You're going to need to take what's available to you as a concessional resident. And that might not be to the standards that you want or where you want or how you want. And a lot of those home care options and other community living options just won't be available. You may find it is just residential care that you're limited to as well. So I think people shouldn't be afraid to retain their resources, to have enough to pay for care as well. And you're absolutely right, Mark, the home is an important part of that resource as well.
Yeah, I'd like to talk about the home and how that comes into the equation, but the point you just made then is the amount of people or clients I would see who would say, I really want to look after my adult kids more than before they look after themselves. And you're just saying, no, you worked hard to build this estate or assets. Yeah. And it's your adult kids aren't asking for it in most cases. They want you to have the best lifestyle for the last chapter of your life, if you can put it that way. But it is interesting, isn't it, how a lot of, especially widow mothers who are just saying, oh, yeah, no, I don't need much. I want to give it to my adult children. You say, no, just that's not the way you should be thinking.
You're right. It's that real sort of nurturing thing that parents have and wanting to leave the legacy to the kids at their own detriment as well. Yes. And we talked a bit about the greed before as well, but we do see, so yes, that's another, but we do see that mindset, exactly what you said, Mark, about the kids. They really want mum or dad to be well looked after, They really do want mum or dad to spend the money and to have the nicest place they can. Sometimes that's about us alleviating our guilt too, that we go, well, if mum's in a lovely aged care place, I don't feel so guilty about it. But it's this genuine concern for the parents. And you do see the parents going, oh, no, I don't need much. It's okay, I'll suffer on. There's a nice balance in between that. And that's where, again, going back to your comment about advice with an objective third person that can sometimes help you to get that balance there to go, do you realise, or why are you thinking that way? And to outline the various options can be a nice key to that.
Yeah. Thank you for that. That's and one of the things about getting advice is, as you were saying about the house, I think it is the home. It's not only just a financial decision, it's one of the biggest emotional decisions for not just mum or dad, but also the adult children. They have their own emotional attachment to this house they grew up in. And so having that as part of the conversation and having advice or having an independent third person who can look at this. But from your point of view as being the specialist and having had a lot of these conversations, where do you see people should think about when it comes to their own house and what are the main considerations they should have?
Yeah, with aged care, we've got two different, I guess we're going to categorise people into two different groups. We got those who are still married or somebody else is living in the house. So, one person might need to go into care, but the house might still be used by other family members. So that's a little bit of a different conversation because we can't just look at selling or renting out that house to afford care. But we still got ways of getting access to the equity. The home is a resource. So the way we get equity back out of that home is to either sell it, to rent it and create an income stream from it, or to perhaps borrow against it using some sort of equity release form, whether it's a sale equity release or a lending equity release. And the government's brought out their pension loan scheme, which they expanded, and that can be a really cheap, easy way of getting equity out. When you've still got family members living there, but we need more money we need to use that house as an option. So that's one way. But then for those people who there isn't anybody else living in the home, so they were the widowed or living alone, and they're moving out of that house into some other form of care situation, we do need to make sensible decisions about the house. It's part of our financial resources. Sitting there empty and vacant means we can lose insurance. If it's empty and nobody's living there, we may not have any building insurance. That can be void. It can also be detrimental, and it's a large resource not working well for that particular person. So decisions about what the options are and how to do that, how to make those choices. And I think this is where good advice is really important, because we need to look at not just day one of the person going into care, what the financials are like, but also how will they change with those different decisions. You can get a very different outcome for Centrelink if you rent the house than if you sell the house. You can get a very different outcome for taxation. You can get a different outcome for your fees. So it's about looking at that over time so that you can make the best considered decision that you can around it. But and I guess people have different emotions. Some people are really willing to say, we just want to sell the house. Others want to keep it while mum or dad are still alive. Neither of those are particularly wrong approaches, as long as you have fully thought through the options, understood the risks, made sure you got sufficient cash flow, and manage the full outcomes. And that's where advice, again, I just really have to say advice is so important in this area, coming to it. But what you need to think about is, if a person is moving out of their home into aged care, even though we're not moving to somewhere that we're owning, it's still, we are moving home. The residential aged care is just a new home, albeit a different legal structure of how that home is operated. So at any time our life situation changes, if I move cities for jobs, or my family grows and I need more space, or my children move out and I need less space, I make decisions all throughout my life about, is the home I'm living in suitable for me to live in? And if not, I find a new home. And then I have to think about, how do I fund the new home? Do I sell my first home? Do I rent it out? Or do I borrow against it to afford my new home? Aged care really is exactly the same. Health means your first home is no longer suitable for you to live in. We're moving to a new home. Now, how do I use my first home to fund my new home? The difference just is aged care has lots of formulas and rules and means testing around what it costs you, and it's a different legal structure. But it's still very similar mindset decision process as any other move in a home.
Okay.
And I was going to say that there's lots of large numbers thrown around on what it will cost you to move into residential care, and people get scared by that. But we also have to remember that you don't have to have those lump sums to move in. Is the same thing as if I'm finding a new home, I can choose to buy one, I can choose to rent one. If you're moving into residential care, you have those same choices. You can choose to pay the lump sum to effectively buy the right to live there, or I could just pay the daily fee and rent the room.
That's
lots
of
choices.
Thank you. Sorry, that's a really good distinguishing about buying or renting. And I do know I've had that conversation with people saying it's just so expensive. I just never realised. But I think that's where you're saying, if you get advice, you do have options, and people don't realise that. So I wouldn't mind going to one of those, because you're sort of saying about means testing, which brings us back to the ACAT assessment. And a lot of people, that's the first thing they're hit with, especially if, unfortunately, mum has broken a hip and the doctor says she's not going back home, and you're just in a bit of a panic and told, okay, to find out a home, the first thing you go to a home, see any possible home that could be suitable. They say, well, you've got to do this ACAT assessment. Do you want to quickly just talk about what that actually means?
Yeah, basically the ACAT assessment is the approval process to get government subsidies.
Right.
So we could go out, and if you decided you need care, you could go out and find a private provider and just negotiate with them, pay the fees, get access to care. But if we want to get the government subsidies, which can help us make it far more affordable, then the first step is we go to the government gateway service, which is the My Aged Care website. So it's just myagedcare.gov.au. And that's our first step to organising that ACAT assessment. When you go to the My Aged Care website, you either phone them or there's an online application, which is submitting your application to be considered. If they feel that that is going to then justify subsidised aged care, they will refer your details on to an ACAT team who will then reach out, phone the person, arrange a face-to-face meeting time, preferably in their home. But if the person's in hospital, the hospital often organise that and help you through that process too. And the ACAT team will come out to the person's home so they can see how the person is coping, what their home environment's like, what support they've got, help them make an assessment about whether we're looking home care or residential care. And then if they think the person does need that level of care, they will at a later point send the approval letter, which gives you the tick of approval to then be able to go to either the home care or residential care providers to show them that if they accept you, you've got government subsidies coming with you. So there's a bit of a process in there. It's really important, I think, that the older person's involved, but also at least one or two of the kids are also there and involved and supporting them to make sure they're understanding what's happening and answering honestly, because we often like to downplay what our needs are. And also to be aware of that from your very first contact to the My Aged Care website to when you've got that approval letter could take several weeks' time. So again, if you've left it till absolute crisis point, then we've got a problem as well. So we might want to think about when we think that the need is really quite obvious and emerging, get started with that process. Just because you've got an approval doesn't mean you have to make any changes. It just means when you're ready to make those changes, you've got that government subsidies tick there as well. So timeframes to consider and also who's going to be involved and just not being afraid of the process, I think are 3 tips for that.
Okay, that's excellent advice there, because funny enough, you raised a really good point there about not being totally truthful. I've had people who have been in their hospital bed, broken hip, and the ACAT team say, "How are you going?" And so, "I'm fine, all good." I'm just saying, well, you're not actually, but yes, having your adult children there, that's a great thing. But the one thing is, it's a very scary process. Getting to go there. My Aged Care, isn't it? My Aged Care website.
My Aged Care. Yeah.
Yep, website, and the ACAT team coming up, but they're usually lovely people. They're really caring. Had good experiences with them. But yeah, I think you don't want to leave it to the last minute. Sometimes you have to, but if you can get that tick of approval and know exactly where you stand, it's just so helpful.
Particularly if, again, you're wanting, as I said, from when you first contact My Aged Care to when you've got the approval, that can take several weeks. Now, if what you're really hoping to do is to get home care services, that even once you've got the approval, you don't start getting the government money immediately. That just puts you onto a waiting list to then wait for a package to become available for you. And that could take up to 12 months. We have had longer periods of waiting for that, but the government's been releasing more and more home care packages to try to bring those waiting periods down. But even once you've got approval, you may have 12 months before the government money starts to come through. Now, remembering too, as we've just said, people leave it until the absolute crisis point before they even make the first contact. And then, that's a very long time. How do you fill in that gap? And sometimes that's private. Sometimes it might just be maybe the family come in and fill in while we're waiting, or maybe it's about using your financial resources, getting some equity out of your home, paying for the private services while you're waiting for the government money to come through. There are ways to manage that as well.
Okay. If we've just spoken about if it is an emergency, but if you actually do have time and you are wanting to, you've heard this podcast today and you want to actually make a bit of a wish list and what to do, What's some of, say, tips to people who are saying helping their elderly parents to prepare for this possible eventuality? What would be, say, your top tips for that?
Oh, top tips. So I think the conversation. So that's the obvious one. We need to have the conversation with the parents and with our siblings, and organise for then a financial planner to become involved too. Because we need to have, the family conversation around what's important and the financial conversation around what's possible financially, and then just start research. I think it's about the research process of go to the My Aged Care website, start to read information about what's happening with aged care and getting a little familiar with it as well. Because even when you go into a financial planner, the more information you know, the better that conversation will be, because the financial planner is going to explain lots of concepts to you. But if you sort of have an understanding and a feeling about them, then that's a much better outcome as well. So I think it's just the research, talking to other people, being aware of, different, looking on magazines and things when they're talking about aged care, reading any books that are available on that. So I wrote a book on aged care. They could have a look out for that. It's called Age the Way You Want. Don't Panic, Age the Way You Want, Where You Want. I'm not sure whether there's many copies around. It was selling out, and we've been talking about whether we do a second reprint or not, but some of the bookstores have it, so you could Google it, Don't Panic. If you Google Don't Panic Aged Care, it will come up and you can see if you can track down a copy of that. So just, I think it's preparing yourself with information.
Yeah, we'll actually put a link to the book, definitely, because I think you can buy it on Amazon still, but I will put a link to that for the book at the end of this.
And I'm sure your book would help too, Mark, so we should put a plug in for that one.
Yep, thank you for that. There is a section on aged care. One of the things you actually mentioned earlier, I think is a really good point, was that having someone who was on a farm and you wouldn't put them into a multi-story aged care. So sort of a wish list of what would suit your elderly parents would be important.
Yeah, it is. So when you're having those conversations with parents, it's about just talking about the reality of that period. So I think it's about those brave conversations, but also understanding, asking, what are you worried about? Because when we're looking at this, and this is what I had to get down with my parents as well, saying, I know I can hear you saying, don't put us into aged care. What are you most worried about? And it was understanding those sorts of questions to then see, is it something we just had to accept and compromise? Or was there a way that then I said, okay, I'll direct my research choices to help minimize those impacts as well for them, So it was about that priority list of what was important to them. And also understanding, what activities. So in aged care places, there's lots of activities that you can do, picking ones that are going to match the parents. I think too, just keep an eye out for open days at aged care facilities. So we haven't had them for a while through COVID because they've been very locked down. But, if you're not ready to make the move, then sometimes they will have open days. This just gives you a chance to go and have a look around and get a feel for what life is like in that aged care facility. Don't just be lulled in by, the big, modern, shiny new buildings, because that might be things that we as the kids say, oh, this looks nice, or I really like that pool, or I like the stainless steel look and design of the place. But you've got to think about this could potentially be your parents' new home. Where are they most comfortable in? What would feel like home to them? Some of the shiny, big, new, fancy ones, they find a little bit clinical. Some people might find that a bit clinical or a bit like a hospital or something not like a home. So you want to think about that. Walk around, and as you look around, see how the staff interact with the residents. Do they say hello? Do they stop and have conversations? Do the residents seem to know who the staff are? Do the staff know the residents' names? Little things like that, if you've got time to be observant, little things like that are good to pick up because you're looking for a new home. If you have left all of that to the last minute and crisis point, and it all becomes urgent, our emotions are going to overplay. We don't make good decisions when we're in emotional turmoil. Our decision making really plummets. Our ability to think and to research and to talk about it also diminish too. So I think it's just reading as much as you can about aged care, having those conversations, starting to do your research. Find a financial planner to start that conversation with you and at least be planning ahead as to what to expect, how to sort out the finances. And that's one that's overlooked. We often see, and I've been unraveling a few problems with advisors recently where kids have gone into property transactions with their parents while their parents were still independent and capable, but maybe financially struggling a little bit, and they've gone together into property transactions. And now that the parents' health's declined and they're moving into aged care, they've uncovered all sorts of problems around how that's going to impact the fees or the ability to pay the fees, or the impacts on age pension and Centrelink. And we can see they did it with all good intentions, but without a fully informed decision-making process, have caused more problems at a later point in time.
Yeah, no, I think with that, and we've both spoken about getting independent advice or financial advice, and it's not because just we're financial or have experience of financial advisors. We've just been, because we're of that age where it's our own families, we've had plenty of friends who have actually said, they've had to do it on their own, and it was the worst experience they've ever gone through, and how good would have been if they had known that they could have gone to a third party to help them with this, because most people do really struggle, and it is exactly, you've said it a few times, as an emotional strain, it's just terrible. And so I think anything that can help you make this easier is a good thing. And definitely not all financial advisors, I was never a financial advisor who specialized in this area, and I realized very early on there were people out there who are far better than that. I would actually refer my own clients or my own situation to other financial advisors. Now, you've actually done a bit of that hard work, and because you have courses that advisors have to go through to sort of have a qualification, do you want to talk a bit about that? Because I think that's just a really helpful service.
Yeah, we made a decision very early on to, rather than to be the financial advisor, that we would support the financial advisors who were giving this advice. And you're right that if you're not doing it every day, then it can be really difficult for a financial advisor to pick it up. And that's the benefit of getting help, is going to somebody who has seen it and helped other people through it. So you want somebody who's had that experience. So we have an accredited aged care professional training program, which helps advisors. And when we train them not just on the rules and the finances, but also on how to have those conversations and the trade-offs and the emotional side, and to really help people create the right emotional and financial decision as well. And then we support them with the tools on an ongoing basis to make sure they're up to date and they're solving the hard problems, and they've got the tools to do this efficiently to keep the costs down as well. So if anyone is looking, I think if you need financial support, the first thing should be ask if you've got a current financial planner or your parents have a current financial planner, ask them first about what their experience has been, whether they are an accredited aged care professional, and whether they have got experience in this space. If they don't, and they don't have somebody else, because quite often they might say, we don't, but here's the specialist we refer to. If they don't have that, then you can go to our website. So our website, which is agedcaresteps.com.au, there is a find an advisor section on there. So the rest of the website's really for the financial planners, but there is a find an advisor section where you can go and see a number of financial planners right across Australia who have done our training, and our training has won industry awards. We're recognised by professional bodies as being the educational pathway for professionalism in aged care. So they've done our course. They work with us closely on an ongoing basis just to make sure they've got the right tools and the right knowledge. And you could just go onto that website, choose somebody that you think might work for you and is close to you, and then reach out and contact them. It's always good to reach out to a couple of different financial planners because, you know, these are all qualified financial planners and are all experienced, but sometimes, again, it's who you feel most comfortable with and who you can interact most effectively with. Different personalities work for different clients as well.
Yeah, and because it is such an emotional decision as well as a financial decision, you just have to feel comfortable with that person. So I agree. Both may be technically fine, but you will feel more comfortable maybe one than the other. So it's important to have that. And thank you. I've seen it on your website. It's a really helpful service, and I think for people who may not have had seen a financial advisor, this is one of those decisions you just need to get right. You really usually only get one chance at this. And for some, it's a quite sizable financial decision. And so having as much help and experience or some from a specialist is just really important.
Can I also just say, Mark, just one thing on that? We often see people who have very little, they might say, Mum or Dad don't have much money and they've got very simple finances and we know what we want to do with the house. We don't need advice. I would still really urge everybody to reach out and get advice still, because they're the people we often see making the biggest mistakes, and they're costly mistakes they can't afford to make. So don't think just because you don't have a lot of finances or because Mum or Dad's finances look simple, that you don't need advice. We think they need advice more than those who've got lots of wealth, actually.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So thank you. I just think, especially if it's a matter of having to sell your house or rent your house, as you were talking about, or borrowing against the house, they're just major financial decisions. And people often forget, well, that's the house, otherwise they don't have any money. Well, no, that's a pretty major asset and makes a lot of difference when it comes to these assessments and means testing.
That's right, it does.
Well, I've kept you long enough. Actually, we could keep it because it is such a big area. And if you don't mind, I will invite you back, because I just think there'll be a lot of questions from this that I will realize as soon as I get off this podcast. Oh, I should have asked Louise that question. So
I could talk on aged care for days. So yes,
but just
weeks.
We have one final question we ask all our guests is, and it's the best piece of advice you ever received, our final bite. So what would that for you be, financial or life?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I'll probably take a financial one just because we've been in a very financial mood here. I think it was probably from my father, who always said, if you can't afford to buy it, don't. He was so against borrowing. He borrowed to buy a house and he borrowed for his business, but nothing else would he ever borrow from. And I even remember in the old lay-by days, my mother putting a dress on lay-by and she paid it off over time. Then when she'd paid it off, she brought it home. He made her take it back because he still saw that as borrowing.
Really?
Yeah. So it was very much, if you can't afford it, then save up and wait and don't borrow for that. But be willing to still borrow in those things that mattered, like your house and business. And I think that's probably kept me on a good financial track through life.
No, excellent piece of advice. We often talk about good debt versus bad debt, and good debt is definitely borrowing for a house or an investment, but bad debt and credit cards and these payment schemes. There's just so many easy access to debt nowadays that I do. It is one of my biggest concerns for millennials is the easy access to debt. So I think that's actually sage advice. So
yeah, and it's interesting because I was just going to say, in aged care, though, we often do talk about debt as a good strategy. So maybe I didn't take my dad's advice very well, but only because, again, with that house being a source of wealth, that where it was just so important we didn't sell the house, but we need the equity out of it. There are debt options that you can do. And they can be good, but again, it's about the considered, why am I borrowing? Is it really worth borrowing? Is there another way around it? And does it make good sense to do that?
Thank you for that.
That's okay.
Well, Louise, we've nearly gone an hour, so it's just flown by. So I just really appreciate your time, your expert opinion, and the easy way in which you explain it. So thank you for being on the show.
My pleasure, Mark. I hope everyone enjoys it.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. If you'd like to know more about Louise or Aged Care Steps, visit www.agedcaresteps.com.au. Also, feel free to email me on admin@themoneysandwich.com or visit my website, themoneysandwich.com, if you have any questions or want to learn more. Want more practical, easy to understand tips and action lists to help with your money stuff? Buy my book, The Money Sandwich, available now on our website, themoneysandwich.com, as well as major online retailers. As with every podcast, this information is not advice, as not personalised to your own situation, and past performance is never guaranteed for the future. What we are trying to do here is provide tips, coaching, and education to help improve your money knowledge, which we believe can only be a good thing. See you next time when we take another bite from the Money Sandwich.